So we have basically the idea of crowdsourcing here. This also is the advent of Ajax. So this is how we get that nice aesthetic of page, sorry, pages loading content without having to refresh the browser. So effectively, this is where you start getting the idea of single page applications coming from, in a way. Around, let's see, so 2004, 2005, the library jQuery really starts to take off. Now, this is a JavaScript library which enables many, many, many different things. But the one that really defines Web 2.0 here is Ajax. Now, this is where we have an asynchronous call between client and server. This is probably where JavaScript starts becoming more of a positive rather than a negative in the web space, because for the longest time, JavaScript was terrible and we hated it. And I still but that's old problems. Basically, JavaScript is not supported very well for the longest time. It's finally become more commonplace. But what JavaScript gets you, though, is the ability to change things on the client dynamically. For the longest time, just to give you a bit of the history here, JavaScript was used for things like um, nifty little user interface experiences, maybe clicking a button, have a little loading thing pop up, and then it shoots you off to another page for the server request. Maybe making like raindrops fall or snowflakes fall, cutesy little things which, enhance the experience but weren't super important. But once Ajax comes along, we now have the idea where you have a browser where, let's say I click a button. Ajax gives us the ability to not have to refresh the page. This becomes important later on. But basically the idea is that on the web, every time you do something, you have to refresh your browser. You have to call a new resource in. You have to do something. Basically, you're clicking this refresh button in a way every time you need to change your page. Ajax means we don't have to do that. It just magically appears. All right. And this is basically what has kind of kicked it off is jQuery. You don't need jQuery to do it. It's JavaScript based, but this is a nice little library to get that going. All right. So just to give you a bit of an example here, so I'll pop this link in the description of the video if you've never used Ajax, but this is just from the W3 Schools site. They have a nice little try it page. Here we have some code on the left. We have the preview on the right. And what we're doing here is that we have a div, which is basically just this let jQuery Ajax change this text, right? You see it right here. I've got a button here. All right, so this is one of the first interesting things. Standard web design, if I have a button, I'm probably going to have it be surrounded by a form field, which we'll talk about later on. This is how we can send data somewhere else. But here, this button has nothing around it. I click it, nothing happens in theory. So actually, let me do something really quickly here. I'm going to cut and paste, or I'm just going to cut out the jQuery stuff here. All right, and I'm going to run this. So if I click get external content, nothing happens, right? There is no code associated with this button. I put the code back in. This is jQuery code to basically dynamically update something on your browser. So without going too deep into this, well, I guess we might as well go deep into this, otherwise it's not going to make any sense. Here we are loading in the jQuery library. Okay, and now once our page is loaded, and once the user clicks the button, we're going to make an Ajax call. So this is a asynchronous call. So we are going to pull the information out of demotest.txt, and on a successful pull, update the contents of this div down here with whatever is inside of demo test. All right, so if I run this now, and I click the button, look at that. We have new content. The header changed, and it also added a paragraph to it. All right, so if let's see, I wasn't sure if it's going to let me see the actual demo.txt in here. Live demos are always fun, but basically the idea here is that, again, I did not refresh the page. typically what would happen on the web is I click this button, I go to another site, or I go to another web page where this content does exist. Here it's dynamically loaded. Why is that interesting? Well, now we can start doing things like randomly pulling new information from a database or having the server push us information, right? We have a nice user experience. Okay, so after this, we start getting into the idea of a responsive web. So this was a big step towards heterogeneous devices. Apologies for this video getting a bit long. I may or may not have it chopped up a little bit just for your benefit. We'll see. But the idea here with responsive web design is that people aren't just using desktops anymore to access the web, right? We have laptops, we have tablets, PDAs, we have phones. You know, you look at responsive web, 2011, start thinking iPhone, iPad timeframe, right? These are becoming more and more popular. Responsive means that we can look at a website and it's going to be the same on any device. Sorry, the same in any device. Basically, we're going to have code in place which allows our website to be rendered nicely. Before responsive, this website would look identical on my phone or my tablet, right? However, it would be horribly scrunched, or our text is going to be weirdly placed because the phone browser can't handle it, or you're going to have to design an entire new website style just for phones. Not the nicest thing. So let's get a nice similar experience for everybody out there. So you can actually replicate this in your browser if you weren't aware by this point. One of the things I highly recommend is getting familiar with the dev tools in whatever your browser of choice is. If you're using Chrome, Firefox, Safari, Brave, any of the big players, they're all probably going to have web tools built in. So I'm going to be using Chrome for this class. So if I click the little menu here, more tools, I see developer tools, which for me is Control-Shift-I. All right, so what we've got here, so the last thing I was looking at was the network tab. We actually see all the resources being pulled in. This is where you can play around with the HTML live if you want. Remember, HTML is rendered on the browser. Once it's here, it's on your computer. So I could say change. Oh, there's probably nothing good in here that I really want to dig with. But let's see, do I have any? Let's play around here. So here's my entire page here. Let me hide this. Oh, that's not gonna do anything. That's a path. Being silly. Anyway, we'll play with that more as we go. But the idea that I want to get across here for responsive is that right now, I'm looking at it in these particular dimensions. So if you actually look at the dev tools here, let me slide this over a bit. Not going to slide for me. Okay. This is what it looks like on a browser with this resolution. Okay. I could change this to look at, say, a Galaxy. So this is what it looks like on a Galaxy. Here's what it looks like on a Galaxy Fold. Here's what it looks like on an iPad. Here's what it looks like on an iPhone 6. A Moto G4. Nest. Basically, I could add whatever custom resolution I want and design for that device. So how does this happen? Well, we have this idea of a media query. So CSS3 brings in the idea or the ability for you to query what device type you have. There are more than just the media query to update your site to be responsive. There's trying to remember, I don't remember what the exact newer one is. I'll have to look that up separately. But basically, you have a way to detect your resolution, whether it's via CSS or JavaScript or whatever you want, and you're going to basically format your page appropriately. CSS gives us kind of a very nice shortcut for doing that. And the kind of cheating / easy way to handle this these days is to just use a responsive framework. Something like Bootstrap is very common right now. But this gives us a heterogeneous experience, right? I go to your site on my desktop, I can understand how to use it on my laptop, tablet, phone. It's all going to look aesthetically similar. Now, once we get to a particular resolution, you might flop it over to a more vertical view, right? So here we see kind of buttons laid out, and I assume if you scroll, your content would be there. So responsive is a big step towards heterogeneous experience. So next paradigm shift, which I'm hopefully not going to use that term too much, is the idea of a progressive web app. Now, this is something which Google coined several years back. Basically, the whole tenet of this idea is that you have a web application, and that's literally all it is. This is just a web app still, but it's been coded in a specific way. So it will work on any browser, it will work as a responsive site, and it's going to be available offline or on slow connections. So this is, if you remember to the early days of Google Drive, for instance, that place where you store your pictures, documents, things of that nature. At one point, you could start using it without the browser or without the internet. This is the idea of a progressive web app. Basically, it's something which is built around the idea of a browsing experience, but your connection is independent. Now, I've got a link to what are progressive web apps because this is, it's kind of a different thought for actually defining web applications in general, and I highly recommend you check it out. But basically, you are taking a standard web application and you're augmenting it with extra capabilities. That's all it really is. Okay? So we get this app-like idea. Keep in mind, too, that this notion is also coming out around the time where apps on phones are becoming very prominent. So why don't we have the idea where a normal website, which is turned into a web application, let's just use it like a phone app. So the idea here is let's take this web application and use a shell model. So let's separate out the content from the functionality. Let's separate out the various architectural pieces of an application. Then we can start targeting different devices. We can look at different latencies or network capabilities. Basically, we're going to take a web application and construct it as a phone app in a way, right? And there are tools out there. Actually get to on the next slide here. There are tools for checking your app to see if it meets these standards. But what do we get out of this idea? Okay, offline connectivity is one thing. I want to use Google Docs offline. Great. How does that work? Well, Google Docs is a web application. So once I turn my network off, I should be using my phone for this example rather than my hand. Okay, I'm working on my document. I lose my network because, I don't know, I go into an area where there's no network connection. Fine. Google Docs keeps working. How does that happen? Well, there's logic in there that's looking for an internet connection. If it's offline, it's just going to buffer these changes locally. Once it sees that network connection again, oops, here's all the changes that have occurred since your last connection. Push those up. Obviously, there's some logic in there to make sure it makes sense, but the idea is that there's extra capabilities in here. All right, other features. We can get push notifications. Similar to your phone, when your app is doing something offline and a little notification pops up saying, hey, it's time to tend to your farm or something like that, right? Web applications can have that too. Just we're going to have server-side logic pushing content to you. And we can install it. So if I want to have my web application be treated as an app, why can't I just store a link to the web app as a link on my phone? Again, this idea of linking everything together. So this other thing is the Lighthouse tool. This is basically an auditing tool to see, hey, does your web app actually meet the progressive standards? So things we care about. Is it secure? We haven't talked about HTTPS yet, but basically this means that your traffic is being encrypted. This is pretty much the standard these days. All right, so is it secure? Will it work on multiple devices and device resolutions, and can you use it offline? So what is this Lighthouse tool? Well, it's actually something that you can build right into Chrome. So you can install it. We're not going to go into this right now, but when we get to progressive apps, we'll probably talk more about that. Okay, other things we care about. So that home screen link doesn't just magically appear. You need some metadata to support it. We need it to be usable in multiple browsers. We need it to load fast. So the idea here is that not every person is going to have the same network connection. They might be using 3G, or I guess 3G's, well, 3G is still fairly common, right? But if you're in an urban area, it's probably 4 or 5G these days. But the idea is that you can deal with slow or laggy internet connections. One other big thing here too is that each page on your site is a URL. So depending on your web application setup, you might start getting some obfuscation of how you get from page to page. So let me give you an example of this. Let's say that you create a website. All right, let's go to efredericks.net again. Okay, well, I click About because I want to see the About Me page. Well, that doesn't reflect itself in the URL bar because I'm using, say, Ajax or something sneaky to just insert content. Technically, it's a different page, but that's not reflected in the URL. I'm sure you have all seen that where you just go to a page and every link you click might be like a pound sign that pops up in the URL bar. The idea here is that we need to be exceedingly clear about the pages because this is going to be a part of their progressive web app requirements, right? So next thing, single page apps. This is actually dipping back a little bit in time before progressive apps, but it's an interesting concept to talk about too. So this is something which came along with Web 2.0 in a way. Now the idea is that we have the ability to rewrite content with Ajax, right? Let's just do our entire site like that. And this is kind of what I was getting into with that page obfuscation issue. This is one thing that you can have with single page models. Now, I go to my homepage. Every single link that I click just stays on that homepage. We are only getting that specific content that we want. So consider, let's say a standard web page has a header, has some content, has a footer, right? I'm sure you've seen applications where you can have the header and the footer and they're like stuck to the top and bottom. And as you scroll, you see the background kind of scroll up, scroll up, scroll up, but the header and the footer stay in the same place. Now, that could be achieved through some, sneaky JavaScript or some CSS queries, not queries, attributes. But one thing that you could do too is that I have this content area. When I scroll, I could dynamically load new content, or I click a link. It replaces the content of that content area. Basically, the idea is that we're only fetching specific resources. We're not fetching the entirety of the page. So this is one thing where if you have a slow connection or you have limited connectivity, that might not be a terrible idea. Because rather than having this big blob of information come down your pipeline, which, if you think back to 2002, not everybody had cable at that point, information kind of chunks along as it's loaded in, we might just be retrieving a small text file or a small paragraph or something like that, right? Basically, we are lowering the amount of requests that need to be made, large requests that need to be made. So to give you a, kind of a flowchart style view of this, here's our client. So this is our browser. This is a single page application setup. I'm going to make my initial request to the server. Okay, I want efredericks.net. Give me my homepage. Okay, server returns that HTML. So I am now seeing my homepage. I click About Me. Okay, the link, instead of just doing a standard URL load, it's not going to be a brand new request to the server. It's going to be an Ajax call, meaning change the main content area to About. All right. And rather than sending an entire massive HTML packet back, we're just going to send a small blob of data. Could be JSON, could be text, whatever the server is configured to send, right? But it's a smaller packet. And then JavaScript on the client side would inject that wherever it's asked for. Now you see this pretty commonly these days with Angular and React. There's also Ember and Meteor. Basically, JavaScript frameworks. All probably going to be based around the initial concepts of Ajax and what jQuery popularized. So, lots of information. Basically, what I'd like you to do now is to check Blackboard. There are a set of readings. There are a couple of assignments for this week. The original web proposal is going to take you a little while to get through, but try and understand and put yourself into the mindset of the time. We didn't have the web as we know it now back then. Consider all the problems that they're trying to solve with this idea and how we actually got to where we are now. And with that, the assignments as well. So you've got your reading reflection. You also have your Google Cloud setup. I've got a separate video for getting your Google Cloud environment up and running, redeeming the credits, so on and so forth. So please make sure you check that out and definitely keep an eye on the deadlines for these assignments. Anyway, hope you have a wonderful day. I will see you next time. Bye, everybody.